Congressman, thank you for being here with me today. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the war in Ukraine. The United States recently met with Russian officials, but there have been criticisms that Ukraine has not been involved in negotiations to an extent some feel they should be. How much, in your view, should the United States involve Ukraine in negotiations to end the war with Russia?
Well, having seen that President Trump has met with President Zelensky, I think Ukraine's involved in the process, maybe not every step of the way, because these are preliminary negotiations. This are talking and consulting with our allies, namely Britain and France, and then talking to, our adversary in Russia and Putin to get a feel for where we are as a baseline for where these negotiations, once you get you gotta find, hone them and fine tune them, what that would look like. And clearly, Ukraine will be a party to those discussions.
Do you feel that they're currently being involved to an extent that you believe they should be, or not so much?
No, I think that if I was Ukrainian, I would definitely want to be at every meeting, and be there every step of the way. But that's not, I don't think, realistic considering the interest that the United States has and some of our EU and NATO allies have, and then of course the aggressor in Russia. But I am cautiously optimistic. It just really is going to depend on how flexible and how realistic Putin is. And does he actually want to end this conflict? He's not going to be able to end this conflict and give no territory back to Ukraine. He's not going to be able to end this conflict without Ukraine having some ironclad security guarantees moving forward into the future. So these are things, there's going to be give and take. And I do think that peace will not make everyone happy. And that's why they're called negotiations, and that's why it's called compromise.
Let me go off of that. Where do you realistically see negotiations heading? You mentioned that you don't feel Russian President Vladimir Putin will want to give up territory, if I heard you right. So where do you see these negotiations heading?
Oh, I'm sure he doesn't want to give up territory, but I feel that he's going to have to get peace. And it's a question of he thought, you have to look at the motivations of Putin. He thought he was going to be in Kyiv within 3 days. And at worst, it would be 3 weeks. And it's 3 years later. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have been killed. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have been wounded. He's got a new 830-mile border with NATO because Finland has joined the alliance. Sweden right behind him. He's lost Scandinavia. He's lost the Baltic Sea. He's decimated his own military. Their combat power is a shadow of what it once was, and he's become a vassal state to China. So he hasn't won a lot. He's taken some turf in Ukraine. Ukraine's still independent. Ukraine is 83% intact, and they've really bloodied the Russian bear's nose. But what Putin wants moving forward is he's got to have a win domestically, or he will lose power. He has a true, real, because he controls the media and the information that his citizens get, but about a 2/3 approval rating with Russian citizens. 2/3 or a little bit better. He's got to maintain that, because if he goes below or hovers around 50% or below that, he's in danger of being overthrown and there'll be a coup. And he needs some wins. And the wins will be, I would imagine, I'm oversimplifying this, but international recognition that Crimea is part of Russia, it's Mother Russia, and some of Eastern Ukraine becomes Mother Russia, and they keep some of the coastline. I don't like the fact that an aggressive dictator becomes rewarded in that regard, but even the Ukrainians recognize that they are not going to get all of their territory back militarily. That's not a possibility. It's not feasible. The Russians have thrown God knows how many landmines all over creation in the East and in territories they hold. And they've also dug lots of ditches everywhere and trenches. They've got twice the size militarily that the Ukrainians can field, and they have 4 times the population. And they're a petrostate. So the Ukrainians have come to the unfortunate realization that it has to be a diplomatic solution to gain at least some of that territory back and have peace. And I think the latest polls that I've seen are 2/3 maybe of the Ukrainian, up to 70%, want some kind of a negotiated peace.
Now, you've also called for permanent United States bases in Eastern Europe, saying they will deter aggression. If Russia ultimately gains more territory as a result of this war, how confident are you that will deter aggression from a regime you've called dictatorial?
It's a great question, and it's a fair one. There's a distinct difference between Ukraine, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Belarus, et al., than a NATO alliance, a nation state that's in the NATO alliance, because of the Article 5 provision, which states an attack on one is an attack on all. So if Putin thought he was going to, let's say, get a little greedy and frisky and invade Finland, or let's say Estonia, then that's paramount. And it's the same thing as if he invaded Nebraska. He has to face the full might of the United States military, which he does not want to do because he knows conventionally he'll be crushed. And then never mind Germany, France, Italy, Britain, Spain, and the rest of the NATO alliance. Poland has become a juggernaut as well militarily. So that's just a completely, it's different not only in scale, but in kind. Now, what the Ukrainians are going to need moving forward is they've had security guarantees in the past. Clearly, they didn't work. So they're going to need some kind of, it's not going to be NATO. I think we all know that, at least right now. I would say some kind of, I would hope in the negotiations that maybe there's a 15 or 20-year moratorium on Ukraine joining NATO, and that will be essentially in Putin's lifetime. But also, they need some kind of de facto guarantee, with probably from Britain, France, and the United States, that if attacked, we will come to their aid.
I do want to ask you a bit more about NATO because after the recent German election, you saw who's likely to be the next chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said basically say something along the lines of he doesn't know if NATO will be able to currently exist in the form it is today with the current Trump administration. What so with that being said, are you confident that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be deterred from potentially going into the Scandinavian states from Poland because of Article 5? As you mentioned, you feel it's a big deal.
I didn't see where, I haven't personally read where Mertz said that. So I have a hard time believing he would say that openly, particularly being that he was just elected and hasn't formed a government yet. So I'm not sure about the premise of the question. But I do believe that NATO by far has been the most successful military alliance in human history. And it's been a great deterrent. The Soviets never attacked a NATO state. So it has been an overwhelming success. And the Russia hasn't, the Federation hasn't attacked a nation state. Now, what we've finally seen is Germany has reached the agreed upon 2% threshold for GDP expenditure for the military. Every country in NATO agreed on that, and roughly, over 10 years ago. But not all of them, in fact, it was a minority at first, that fulfilled that commitment. Now we see Germany has hit it. All of the Eastern European members in NATO have, because they're closer to the threat. We see France and Britain, and now Britain has just said that not only are they going to reach, they're exceeding the 2%, they're going to go to 2.5, and in 10 years they want to hit 3%. That's heartwarming to me because that is a shared burden, and there's no freeloaders in that kind of a situation. Unfortunately, we've got our friends, the Canadians, the Spaniards, and the Italians. Hopefully will follow suit as well. They're rich, industrialized, developed nations, and they need to fully participate. Because here's a question that I asked the NATO Secretary General, and he was very fair about his answer because he said he wasn't sure. But I asked him when I was there in Europe a year ago, if every NATO state had fulfilled their commitment to at least 2% of GDP spent on the military, do you think that Russia would have invaded Ukraine? Or, piggybacking on that question, what if would it have been less likely that Putin would have invaded Ukraine? And his answer was, we don't know for sure, but I suspect he wouldn't have, and he certainly would have given him more pause. So it's a good deterrents do work, and we need our European friends to do their part.
I would like to read the exact quote for you. This is from Reuters. Referring to a NATO summit scheduled for June, Merz said he was curious to see, quote, whether we will still be talking about NATO and its current form then, or whether we will have to establish an independent European defense capability much more quickly. Your thoughts?
No, I don't think that they're honestly in a position to, considering that the country of Finland has more artillery pieces than Germany. Finland's a country of 5.5 million people. Germany has somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 million. So they have just, unfortunately, our German friends have really been lax with their defense over not just years, but decades. So what I think the more practical, and that might have been playing to a domestic audience. I think in a practical sense, I'm going to get my crystal ball out here. Oh, you know what I see? I see a stronger NATO 6 months from now than that is today. I think that Germany fully participates. They have it, as I mentioned, the 2% threshold. And I think that might have been just a little bit political posturing before he formed a government. And we need Germany, I think, in the alliance. I think it's stronger with full participation of the major, I shouldn't say major, but the larger countries in so much as France, Germany, Britain, and the United States.
And I do want to ask you as well, so we're wrapping up here. President Donald Trump has called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator. Your thoughts on the president's words? Do you agree with the president?
Well, I think he said that because it was problematic in so much as Zelensky was elected to a 5-year term, and then there was elections to be held, and they weren't held. And that should be troubling for anyone. Imagine if an American president didn't hold elections, every 4 years, there would be issues. So I do think, and I think it's more constructive for both President Trump and President Zelensky to have their more spirited exchanges in private rather than in public, because if we can show a more united front, it does help our negotiating posture, because the United States and Ukrainian interests are aligned in so much as we want a free, sovereign, and independent Ukraine, and as much territory as possible reconstituted, and then they need to hold elections as soon as possible.
But you've called Russian President Vladimir Putin a dictator. Would
Well,
you
he is a
call
dictator.
Ukrainian President Zelensky a dictator?
I haven't, no.
So do you agree with the president?
I haven't called him a dictator.
Do you agree that with the president's rhetoric on that?
I agree with the president's concern that there needs to be elections in Ukraine.
And as we look forward to the future, how much funding, if any, do you feel the U.S. should provide Ukraine?
Well, when you think about it, again, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but I would much rather have peace and have the United States contribute to Ukraine, like for a one-time loan for reconstruction, much like we did with the Marshall Plan. And I love the fact that President Trump is talking about, most Americans and folks around the world don't realize that Ukraine has the fourth most natural resources of any nation state. And we've got almost 200 or so, depending on how you count them, countries in the world. And they're the fourth wealthiest in natural resources. So for the United States and the President Trump to take the lead on this and to say, hey, we would like some mineral rights with Ukraine, I think that helps not only the United States, but Ukraine develop their resources so they can fund that reconstruction, because, Russia has wreaked havoc. We're also talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian assets that were frozen. How many dollars are we talking in that pool that could be used for Ukrainian reconstruction? So I would much rather have a one-time loan moving forward rather than this slow bleed of $175 billion over the last 3 years of American taxpayer money committed to Ukraine. And if we don't have resolution, that's going to be very costly moving forward for the EU. And I don't know if there's even the political will to continue along that road.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell our audience about U.S. negotiations with Ukraine to end the war?
I will say this, and some people will scoff at this, but I truly believe it, that the best thing that could have happened for Ukraine is President Trump to triumph in November of last year. And let me explain. If Kamala Harris had won, I didn't hear a plan for her vis-a-vis Ukraine. It just would have been this war of attrition. And a war of attrition, when you have a country of 40 million people and you're fighting a country with 160 million people that have more resources, doesn't usually go well for you. And at least President Trump has acted boldly and said, we need to end this. We need to end the killing. We need stability. We need peace, and lead on a compromise. And I want the West I want Ukraine and the West to come out better for it. So he's being bold and he's risking political capital to do it, but it's a courageous move. And I do, as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can see a brighter future for Ukraine, Europe, the United States, and the world at large.
U.S. Representative Pat Fallon, Representative, we appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. God bless. Take care.